When the morning whistle blew, Nate Carver was already sweeping crumbs from the counter, trying not to look at the clock. The diner was empty, except for the sound of the refrigerator humming and the rain pressing against the windows. Another overnight shift done. He rolled the coins from his apron into his palm, quarters, dimes, one crumpled tip, and counted slow, like maybe the numbers would change if he gave them enough time. Rent was late again. Daycare wanted payment by Friday, and June's shoes, the only pair she had, were splitting at the seams. He closed his fist around the coins, feeling their edges bite into his skin. The manager passed by without a word, only a nod that said, "See you tonight." Nate hung the apron by the door and stepped out into the gray light breaking over the river. The town was still asleep. His breath rose in small clouds as he crossed the empty lot, his shoes soaking through from the puddles. A truck passed, spraying dirty water across his jeans, but he didn't flinch. He was used to it, being invisible, being tired, being just enough to survive. At the bus stop, he leaned against the post and stared down at the road leading east, toward the place everyone called the river grave. The old mill sat out there, half buried by vines, the wheel long stopped, roof eaten by time. He'd heard people laugh about it at the diner, how only fools thought they could make anything of it. But Nate had stopped trusting the town's laughter a long time ago. They laughed when he took extra shifts. They laughed when he showed up to the PTA meeting alone. They'd laugh again if they knew what he was thinking now. He pulled the folded newspaper clipping from his jacket. Property auction, Riverbridge Mill, minimum bid $4,000. It wasn't logic that made him keep it. It was the small, impossible pull of a word, river. Something steady, something that kept moving no matter how much weight it carried. When the bus came, he climbed aboard, took his seat, and stared out the window at the passing trees. His reflection looked older in the glass than the man he felt he was. 38 shouldn't look like 50, but the years had done their carving. He thought of June, of how she asked last night if the lights would stay on this month. He had told her yes, though he didn't know if it was true. The road followed the river for a while, then turned away. He pressed the signal cord. The driver looked back at him through the mirror, but didn't ask questions. Nate stepped down into the chill air, pocket full of coins, eyes on the direction the water ran. He didn't have a plan, only a gut feeling that maybe, just maybe, something left to rot wasn't always worthless. Sometimes it just needed someone desperate enough to believe in it again. He started walking toward the mill, the sound of the river growing louder with every step. The road to the mill narrowed until the asphalt gave way to gravel, then to mud. Nate's shoes slipped twice before he reached the bridge, a sagging skeleton of timber that looked ready to fall into the current below. The sound of rushing water echoed up from the creek, steady and hungry. Beyond it stood the Riverbridge feed and mill, leaning, bowed, and split down the spine like an old horse that had carried too much weight for too long. June hopped from one dry patch to another, her backpack bouncing against her shoulders. She stopped at the edge of the dock, staring at the warped boards that dipped under her small boots. The air smelled of moss and wet iron. Somewhere inside the hollow building, a loose shutter knocked with the wind. "This it?" she asked. "This is it," Nate said, though even saying the words out loud felt like he was tempting fate. The place was worse up close. The loading dock leaned toward the creek like it was trying to surrender. The walls were lined with planks that had twisted from years of sun and rain, and ivy had claimed whole corners, crawling up and over broken windows. He could see where water had chewed at the stone foundation, little channels cutting through mortar like veins. A pickup rumbled by on the road behind them. Two men in dusty caps slowed just long enough to roll their windows down. "You buying ghosts, Carver?" one of them called. Laughter trailed behind the truck as it sped off, kicking gravel in its wake. Nate smiled, thin and quiet. He'd heard worse. He turned back to June, who was tracing her fingers along the siding. "It smells funny," she said. "Funny how?" She tilted her head and sniffed again, face scrunching in thought. "Like bread and thunderstorms," she said finally. "Like Grandma's kitchen after rain." Nate looked up at the broken roofline. The air was damp with river mist, and somewhere beneath the rot and mildew was something else. Yeast, maybe. Ghosts of flour and grain still hiding in the boards. "Maybe it remembers what it used to be," he said. She smiled at that, a small crooked grin that tugged at something in his chest. Inside, the floorboards groaned under his weight. Dust swirled like smoke in the light from the windows. Old burlap sacks lay split open, their contents long gone, and the rusted machinery sat still as monuments. It was the kind of place no one believed in anymore, and maybe that was exactly why he did. He took out his phone, opened the calculator app, and typed in the figures he'd been running since the night before. If he skipped rent this month, he could just barely make the down payment. Maybe fix the roof before winter. Maybe make a life out of what everyone else had abandoned. He looked out the window at the creek cutting through the earth, fast and constant. June was outside, arms spread wide, turning slow circles in the cold light. She was right. The air did smell like bread and thunderstorms, and for the first time in months, he felt something close to hope. The air inside the mill felt heavier than the morning fog outside. Nate pushed the warped door open with his shoulder, and it let out a long groan before giving way. A smell rose up: wet wood, old grain, metal gone to rust. The place had not been touched in decades, and every surface showed it. Burlap sacks lay slumped like bodies along the wall, some split open to reveal the dry husks of wheat that had turned to dust. A rusted auger stretched across the floor like a relic of some half-remembered industry. June slipped in behind him, her boots tapping the planks, eyes wide and curious. "It's like a shipwreck," she whispered, the sound small against the echo of the empty room. "More like a graveyard," Nate said, but his tone carried no despair. He pressed his palm against one of the support beams. Beneath the layers of grime, the wood was solid. When he rapped it with his knuckles, the sound came back deep and sure. The skin was ruined, yes, but the bones were good. He walked further in, stepping over a fallen pulley wheel and a collapsed workbench. Light leaked through the broken roof, cutting sharp angles across the dust. It fell on a small office tucked in the corner, a door half hanging on its hinges, a single window fogged with dirt. Inside sat a desk buried under a mountain of ledgers. The top one was open, the pages stiff with time. The ink had bled in places, names and numbers blurring into soft shadows. But Nate could still read a few words. Feed order, Riverbridge Co-op, 1957. He turned the page carefully. The handwriting changed, entries shrinking as if the person had grown tired or old. The last date was from the early 70s, then nothing but blank pages. June picked up a piece of broken glass and turned it toward the light, watching it scatter little beams across the ceiling. "Did Grandpa ever come here?" she asked. "No," Nate said. "This was before his time." He smiled faintly. "Before mine, too." She brushed her fingers along the ledger's spine. "Feels sad. Like somebody forgot it, maybe," Nate said, glancing up toward the rafters. "Or maybe it's been waiting." He knelt by the wall where the floor met the foundation. Moisture glistened on the stones, but the mortar held strong. He pressed his hand against it, feeling the stubborn weight of the old mill resisting the years. There was strength here, the kind that didn't show up on paper or in bank accounts. He stood and looked around again, at the sagging roof and the dust-filled air, at the decay that couldn't quite erase the purpose built into every beam. This place wasn't just ruins. It was something that had survived. Outside, the creek kept chewing at the edges, but inside, in the half-dark, he could almost imagine the hum of the machines again, the rhythm of life returning. June reached out her hand. "Can we stay a little longer?" He nodded. "Yeah, let's see what's left." Mrs. Alvarez did not knock. By the time Nate heard the soft shuffle of her shoes on the gravel and stepped outside, the screened door creaked once, and she was already halfway down the path, shawl pulled tight against the river wind. On the stoop, she had left a grocery sack with the top rolled over twice and a coffee can filled with nails sorted by size. On the sack she had written one word in block letters with a blue pen: "Welcome." Nate carried the bag inside and set it on the counter beside the camp stove. June hovered at his elbow, trying to see without being told to stop peeking. He opened the sack and found a lidded container still warm and sweating at the edges, a loaf of bread wrapped in a faded tea towel, and a small bunch of parsley bound with string. The container was soup, thick and golden. He touched the lid and felt a sting in his eyes. He pretended was just the steam. The nails clinked bright when he poured them onto a plate. Straight, not bent, little lines of help. He picked out a handful and walked to the back door where the hinge screws had stripped, the wood chewed soft by years of rain. June followed with the screwdriver, solemn as a nurse. Together they backed the old screws out, plugged the holes with matchsticks, and turned the new ones in until the hinge sat square and the door closed without a groan. He tested it twice. It held. Back at the camp stove, he filled a little pot with water from the jug and set it to boil. Rice first, then eggs cracked into the skillet with a careful one-handed tap. June arranged their 2 cups on the upturned crate they used as a table and smoothed the tea towel until the bread looked like a guest. She brushed the crumbs into her palm and blew them into the sunlight, smiling when they glittered in the dusty beam. They ate quietly, the way tired people do when the food is good and the room is almost warm. The soup tasted like onions cooked a long time and a bone somewhere deep in the pot. The bread was soft in the middle and hard at the edges, perfect for dipping. Nate tore pieces for June and watched her cheeks flush with heat. The river made its steady sound beyond the wall. The mill breathed in drafts and old smells. When the dishes were rinsed and turned upside down to dry, he went back to the door with the plate of nails and the hammer. He set a brace along the splintered jamb, checked the fit, and took slow swings until the wood tightened under his hand. Every strike sent a small echo through the building, as if the place were answering back. June lined the remaining nails by size on the windowsill and counted them like beads. She set 2 aside and said they were for luck. As the last light thinned, Mrs. Alvarez's form appeared once more at the edge of the property, a small wave, and then the slow walk home. Nate raised his hand in thanks, and she nodded without stopping. The door closed on a clean latch. The cups sat side by side on the crate. June tugged the tea towel straight one more time and looked around like a hostess after the first guests have gone. "It is almost a house," she said. "Almost," he agreed. They lay down that night on their bedrolls with the soup warming them from the inside and the scent of bread still in the air. The river kept talking, the new screws held, and for a few hours the mill, the man and the child rested the way things rest when they know morning work will meet them kindly. Dean Huxley arrived with the kind of smile Nate had learned to distrust, the polished sort that came with handshakes too tight and compliments too round. His truck rolled up the dirt drive just as Nate was prying up a warped plank from the loading dock. The man leaned against the doorframe, his cologne cutting through the smell of sawdust and river air. "Well, if it isn't the man of the hour," Huxley said, voice too loud for the empty yard. "Heard you finally found yourself a little project." Nate wiped his hands on his jeans. "Just fixing what I can." "Sure you are," Huxley said, stepping inside without waiting for an invite. His gaze swept over the place, the patched walls, the piles of salvaged tools, the makeshift camp stove, and lingered on the peeling paint with visible amusement. "Quite the palace you've got here. Can't imagine what the taxes must be on such prime real estate." Nate didn't answer. He had seen Huxley at town meetings, always in tailored shirts, always talking about revitalization. Men like him didn't visit out of concern. They came to measure what they could take. Huxley crouched beside the dock post and tapped it with his knuckle. "Word around town is you bought this place outright. No mortgage, no lien. That right?" "That's right." "Well," Huxley said, straightening with a grin, "lucky for you, I happen to know a developer who's been eyeing riverfront property. Folks who could make this place shine again. You'd be out from under the repairs, walk away with a nice bit of change." "How much change?" Nate asked. Huxley named the number casually, as if it were generous. It wasn't even a year's salary at the diner. Nate almost laughed. "That's what you think it's worth?" "I think," Huxley said, shrugging, "that sometimes a man's got to know when to cut his losses. It's an old building, Nate. Dangerous even. Be a shame if something happened to it before you could get it insured. There it was, the real offer behind the smile. "I'll take my chances," Nate said quietly. Huxley chuckled and brushed invisible dust from his cuff. "Suit yourself. But when you change your mind, my number's the same." He gave a little salute and walked back to his truck, boots crunching over gravel. That afternoon at the diner, Nate could feel the eyes on him. Someone had already told the story. "Hey, millman," one of the regulars called from the counter. "When's your grand opening?" Another chimed in. "Hope you're putting in a drive-through. I want my biscuits quick." Even the cook smirked when Nate came in to clock his shift. Laughter followed him like a shadow, low and familiar. The sound small towns made when someone stepped out of place. He didn't answer. He just tied on his apron and started the next batch of eggs, the spatula steady in his hand. Behind the noise and the jokes, he could still hear the mill's quiet pulse, the creak of beams that had survived storms, the sound of something old refusing to die. The storm came in low and loud, the kind that made the river seem alive again. Wind clawed at the windows, and the mill shuddered like a thing waking from sleep. Nate had wedged a towel under the door to keep the rain from seeping in. But by the second hour, the roof started to drip in 3 different places. June stood barefoot on the cot, counting the leaks aloud like stars. When the wind finally cracked open the soffit above the office window, a sheet of wet dust and birds' nests came loose and scattered across the floor. June gasped as something clanged down with it, a thin, dented rectangle of tin that skidded to a stop by her foot. She bent to pick it up, wiping grime away with her sleeve. Under the rust, letters appeared in faded red paint. "Riverbridge Co-op, we grind so no one goes hungry." She turned it over in her hands and brought it to the light. Nate took it from her and stared for a long moment. The slogan felt familiar, like a hymn half-remembered. He traced the embossed edges with his thumb. This wasn't just a feed mill, he murmured. It was a co-op. People owned it together. June tilted her head. "Like a club?" "More like a promise," he said. "They'd bring their grain here, grind it, share the profit." Everyone ate. Everyone worked outside. The storm rolled deeper into the valley, the thunder flattening into distance. Inside, the old building smelled of wet earth and history. Nate leaned the sign against the desk and crouched by the wall where it had fallen from. Behind the missing board, faint outlines of old posters clung to the plaster. Farmers in overalls, families smiling with sacks of flour. Letters washed out but legible enough to read, "Riverbridge feeds, built by many for many." He stood there longer than he meant to, feeling the air shift. For months, he had seen the place as dead lumber and debt. Now he saw ghosts of life, 1,000 hands that once kept the wheels turning, a community that had fed itself before progress starved it out. June's voice cut through the silence. "Maybe it can do that again." He looked at her, surprised. "What do you mean?" "Well," she said, shrugging, "you fix stuff. I can help. Maybe people could come here again, for food, or something." The thought sat between them, fragile but bright. He looked at the sign again, at the slogan weathered but still clear. The paint was chipped, the metal bent, but the message had outlasted every owner. Later that night, when the rain softened to drizzle, he hung the sign back on the wall above the doorway. The light from the lantern caught the letters just right, making them glow like embers. June grinned. "Now it looks like it's watching over us," she said. Nate smiled faintly. Maybe it always was. As they settled down for the night, the river murmured under the floorboards, carrying silt and secrets. The mill no longer felt abandoned. It felt patient, like it had been waiting for someone to remember what it was built for. The ledger was stuck shut by time itself. Its spine had swollen from years of damp, the pages fused by dust and the ghosts of ink. Nate set it on the desk and pressed his palm against the cracked leather cover. The embossed letters had faded to nothing, but he could still make out faint impressions beneath the grime. Riverbridge Feed Co-op, accounts. June leaned close, chin on her crossed arms. "Think it's full of secrets?" "Probably debts," Nate said with a smile that didn't quite hold. He took a thin knife from his pocket and began to ease the pages apart. The paper sighed as it opened, like a long breath drawn after decades. The first few sheets were water-stained and blank, but then the ink returned, looping and uneven. Names, dates, numbers, and beside them notations that made no sense in any modern account book. "Paid in eggs," June read aloud, pointing at one column. "What does that mean?" "Barter," Nate said, tracing the line with his finger. "They didn't always pay in cash. Eggs, flour, labor, whatever they had." He flipped to another page and found an entry marked "Widow's Allotment, no charge." The handwriting was the same, steady and firm. A few lines later, "School fund, half rate." Then another, "Miller's son, work credit for repairs." The deeper they went, the more it read like a story rather than an account. This wasn't just a business, it was a lifeline. The margins were full of notes, small kindnesses written in careful penmanship. Rain ruined crops, postponed payment. Child ill, send sack anyway. Thank her for the bread. June's eyes widened. They helped people even when they couldn't pay? "Looks like it," Nate said quietly. "They kept everyone fed. No wonder the town survived so long back then." He sat back, thumb resting on a page marked 1933. The handwriting faltered here, but the words carried more weight than numbers ever could. "The river runs low, the grain thinner, but the hands still come. Keep the stones turning." Nate closed his eyes. He could almost hear them. The creak of wooden wheels, the grind of stone, the laughter of men and women hauling sacks together. Not profit, but purpose. Every name in the ledger had been part of that rhythm. He looked at June. "You see this? This mill wasn't about getting rich. It was about keeping the town alive." June nodded slowly. "Maybe it could do that again." He smiled faintly, feeling the same warmth that had come when they found the old sign, the same pulse of belonging. He wiped the dust from the cover and closed the ledger gently, as if afraid it might crumble if he let it go too fast. Outside, the late afternoon light turned gold against the broken windows. Dust swirled like flour in the air. The place felt different now, less like a ruin, more like a promise whispered across generations. Nate set the ledger back on the desk, his hand lingering there. "We grind so no one goes hungry," he said softly, repeating the words from the sign. June looked up at him, eyes shining. "Then let's start grinding again." And for the first time since moving in, the silence of the mill felt alive, waiting for them to make it sing again. The creek behind the mill had shrunk to a slow ribbon by late summer, its banks littered with branches and the bones of old machinery. Nate followed it one afternoon, shovel in hand, tracing where the current licked at the foundation stones. The air was thick with silt and dragonflies. June skipped beside him, flicking pebbles into the shallows. When the shovel struck metal, the sound echoed through the hollow yard like a bell. He knelt, brushing away mud until the shape took form, a corroded axle, half swallowed by earth. Beside it, curved boards radiated outward in broken segments, each with a pattern of bolts eaten by rust. He sat back on his heels, staring. It wasn't junk. It was history. "Dad, what is it?" June asked, crouching beside him. "It's part of the water wheel," he said. "What used to power the mill?" June frowned, trying to picture it. "Like a big fan?" "Sort of," Nate said, smiling. "Water turned it instead of wind. That spinning made the gears move inside, grinding grain, running belts, everything." He stood and looked at the creek again, imagining it a century ago, faster and deeper, churning with spring melt. The wheel would have sat right here, half in shadow, half in light. He could almost hear the rhythmic splash, the heartbeat of the town. Back inside, he rummaged through the drawer where they'd been keeping scraps of paper and old receipts. He found a pencil stub and began to sketch. June watched, head tilted. Lines took shape, an undershot wheel, low to the water, with paddles wide enough to catch the flow. He marked where the axle would meet the shaft, where the belt could run to the generator he'd salvaged from an old mower. It wouldn't power much, maybe a single bulb if he wired it right, but it would mean the mill could breathe again under its own strength. When he showed the drawing to June, her eyes widened. "You can really make that work?" "Maybe," he said. If the creek keeps running and I don't mess up the bearings. June smiled. Then you won't. That night, long after she fell asleep, Nate sat by the lamp with the sketch in his hands. He remembered stories his father used to tell about fixing engines without manuals, just by listening to what was wrong. Everything that moves wants to keep moving, his father had said. You just have to give it away. The creek whispered through the open window, steady and sure. He folded the drawing carefully and set it beside the ledger. Together they looked like a plan, one written by time, the other by hope. The next morning he went out with a wrench and started digging deeper around the axle, loosening what the years had claimed. The soil gave way slowly, reluctant but not refusing. When he finally lifted the first piece free, it was heavy and cold in his hands, streaked with the green of old copper. It was nothing special to look at, just metal and memory. But as the sunlight hit it, something inside Nate sparked too. If he could make this wheel turn again, even once, he thought, maybe the town's laughter would sound different the next time it reached him. Rosa Delgado arrived in a hatchback that looked held together by bumper stickers from a dozen school fundraisers. She parked by the leaning dock and climbed out with 2 plastic bins and a kind of steady cheer that did not ask permission to exist. June ran to meet her, and Rosa laughed as the girl tried to lift a bin too heavy for her arms. "Gloves," Rosa said, popping the lid with her thumb. "Work gloves in every size. Some are mismatched, but they keep fingers attached. And tarps. My cousin runs the soccer league. Lost and found is a treasure chest if you wait long enough." Nate took the second bin and followed her inside. The room brightened with the change in air, as if the mill recognized someone who knew how to organize chaos. Rosa set the tarps down, unrolled one across a patch of floor where the roof still dripped, and pegged the corners with old bricks. June slid under the blue plastic and peered up at the drip, satisfied when it struck the tarp and ran off into a bucket. "You grew up here," Nate said. "You knew this place when it worked." Rosa walked to the wall where the tin sign hung. She touched the raised letters lightly with the back of her fingers. "My father used to unload sacks here with 3 other men, 2 at a time on that broken dock." She turned to the ledger on the desk and smiled without opening it. "We kept a page in that book. My mother called it our winter page. When layoffs hit the cannery, the coop ground flour at night. No one went hungry on Riverbridge Road, not that year." June listened the way children do when a story feels like it belongs to them. "Did you have a club?" she asked. "Like a secret club?" "No secret," Rosa said. "That was the point. We made signs, we knocked on doors, we told people to bring what they had and take what they needed. It was messy and beautiful, and it kept going until people forgot how to do things together." She opened the other bin and passed out gloves. Nate pulled on a pair that pinched at the knuckles, but held. Rosa tied a kerchief over her hair and looked around, measuring the room the way a teacher measures a lesson. "What if it is that again?" she said. "Not as a challenge, but as simple curiosity. Not a business that squeezes every penny. A place that turns and feeds. A place that says yes before it finds the reasons to say no." The question settled like dust and stayed in the air. Nate looked at the wheel shaft he had dug from the creek and at the sketch he had left on the table. He did not know where to find permits or how to keep the dock from sliding another inch toward the water. He knew how to lift, how to align a crooked board, how to keep a promise even when it hurt. "We can start with what we have," he said. "If the wheel turns, it will light 1 bulb, maybe 2. Enough to work after dark. Enough to show this place is still a place." June tugged on a pair of child-sized gloves with purple palms and clapped once for herself. She grabbed a broom taller than she was and began at the doorway, pushing a line of dust toward the light. Rosa smiled and found another broom, and then another. The sound of bristles on wood filled the room like a soft rain. Outside, the creek kept speaking. Inside, 3 people stood where the floor was solid and, without saying it, agreed to call more people in. The mill did not feel like a ruin. It felt like a room getting ready for company. And the question kept echoing in Nate's head long after Rosa drove away. What if it is that again? The sound of repair became their rhythm. Mornings began with the creak of the jack lifting sagging beams, the rasp of Nate's plane shaving soft curls of pine, the steady thud of nails finding new purchase. Each blow rang through the hollow mill like a heartbeat, learning to trust itself again. June swept, always sweeping. The broom was too big, its handle nearly reaching her chin, but she dragged it through the dust with fierce concentration. When the light came through the cracks in the siding, the dust turned to gold, and she pretended she was chasing sunbeams into corners. Sometimes she named them. "This one's yours, Dad. You missed a spot." He'd laugh, half from exhaustion, half because it was true. The broom left arcs across the floor, and behind her, for the first time, the wood looked alive. They patched walls with scavenged boards, old fence slats, bits of pallet. Nate measured twice, cut once, and muttered the way his father used to when something fit better than expected. He didn't have proper tools, just an aging handsaw and a hammer with a handle wrapped in electrical tape. But each repair, no matter how small, seemed to change the air inside the building. It was less hollow now. When the noon bell from town drifted across the valley, Nate called for a break. They ate rice and beans from an old pot balanced on the camp stove, sitting on overturned buckets like kings of a small kingdom. June dipped her spoon and grinned. "Tastes better here," she said. "Hard work makes the seasoning," he answered. In the afternoons, they tackled the walls along the east wing, where the boards had warped into waves. Nate braced studs with crossbeams cut from fallen limbs. Every strike of the hammer made the structure flinch, then settle stronger. Sweat streaked his arms, the grain dust coating his skin, until he looked carved from the same wood he was fixing. June sang nonsense songs while she worked, something about rivers and pancakes and the brave broom of Riverbridge. When she got tired, she'd curl up on a pile of grain sacks, watching the roof light change color. The rhythm of her father's labor lulled her to sleep more reliably than any lullaby. As the days stretched, the place began to smell less of rot and more of pine and earth. Even Rosa's donated tarps looked proud, stretched tight across patched rafters. By the fifth evening, when Nate turned off the generator's faint hum, the mill was quiet in a different way, not empty, but listening. He stood in the doorway, looking at the space they'd reclaimed inch by inch. His hands ached, his back throbbed, but the ache felt honest. June came to stand beside him, holding her broom like a flag. "We're winning," she said softly. He looked down at her, then at the glow of the last sunlight slipping through the open panels. Splinters, sweat, laughter, and dust. That's what victory looked like here. For the first time in months, Nate didn't feel like a man patching ruins. He felt like a builder again. At first, the change came quiet. The laughter that used to follow Nate through town started to fade, replaced by pauses, people slowing their trucks when they passed the mill, eyes lingering a little longer. He could feel it every time he stepped outside for air. The curious hush before talk becomes something else. One morning, an old van rolled up just as Nate was hauling scrap out to the pile by the creek. The driver climbed out. A wiry man with a limp and hands permanently stained by work. "You Carver?" he asked. Nate nodded, unsure. "Name's Leroy Dunn. Used to wire half this town before my back gave out." The man squinted toward the patched roofline. "Heard you're bringing this beast back to life." "Trying to," Nate said carefully. Leroy chuckled. "Trying's half of doing. Got some spare wire, conduit, junction boxes, all left over from a county job that went belly up. If you're willing to take 'em, I'll drop 'em off. Hate to see good copper rot." Nate blinked, caught off guard. "That'd help more than you know." Leroy shrugged like it cost him nothing. "Don't thank me yet. You're gonna need better breakers than whatever fossil's still in there." He laughed and drove off, dust rising behind his taillights. That afternoon, a pair of teenagers appeared at the edge of the property. Jeans torn, boots too clean to be locals. "Mr. Reed sent us," one of them called. "Shop class project. Said you could use some hands." Mr. Reed was the high school's shop teacher. Nate had fixed his truck once for $20 and a handshake. He hadn't realized the man remembered. The boys worked clumsily but hard, dragging out rusted barrels, stacking wood, sorting what could still be used. June supervised from the doorway, holding a clipboard she'd made from an old cereal box. "You missed a spot," she said often, imitating her father's dry tone. Word spread the way good things do in small towns, through the hum of curiosity. Cars began slowing less out of judgment and more out of interest. Rosa stopped by with sandwiches and a flyer for the community center's harvest fair. "You should have a booth," she said, "even if it's just to tell people what you're doing." "I'm not doing anything yet," Nate said. She smiled. "You're proving that maybe we still can." By the end of the week, the scrap pile was half the size, and the interior smelled of clean sawdust instead of mold. A makeshift circuit lit one bulb near the entrance. It flickered, but it worked. Leroy stopped by again just to see it, muttering approval under his breath. June danced under the light, arms spread wide, face glowing in its faint halo. "See, Dad? The mill likes us now." Nate watched the bulb hum against the dusk. The laughter from town had changed. It wasn't cruel anymore. It was curious, even a little proud. He could hear it drifting from the diner, softer now, almost like hope disguised as gossip. The mill didn't look finished, not even close, but for the first time it didn't look doomed either. It looked like something waiting for the rest of the town to remember what it had once meant to them. Night settled like a blanket patched from shadow and moonlight. The single bulb by the door buzzed faintly, throwing a small, warm circle across the mill floor. June had fallen asleep beside the ledger, curled up in her sleeping bag, a hand resting on one of the pages as if she were guarding it. Her hair had caught flecks of sawdust that glittered when she breathed. Nate sat on a bucket, elbows on his knees, staring at the water wheel drawing tacked to the wall. The sketch had smudges now, fingerprints darkening the edges. Outside, the creek whispered through the dark, the same sound that had been there long before any of them. He thought of everything they'd done in just a few weeks: patching, sweeping, wiring, finding help where he hadn't dared ask for it. The place had changed because they had refused to walk away, but it still needed more. The wheel remained silent, its bones half buried in the riverbank. Every time he looked at it, he felt the same pull, the need to see it move, to hear the first splash of turning water. Not for show, not for pride, but because it would mean the mill had a pulse again. He looked at June. She had insisted on staying even after he'd told her the floorboards creaked and the roof leaked. "We're keeping it company," she'd said. "Old things don't like being alone." Her words echoed now, soft as breath. He reached out, tucking the blanket around her shoulder. "You've got a big heart, kid," he whispered. "Bigger than this whole place." The promise came out before he could stop it, quiet but certain. "We'll turn that wheel before school starts. You'll see it move. You'll see what it means when something wakes up because you cared enough to touch it." The weight of those words settled deep in him. They weren't just for her. They were for himself, for every long morning at the diner, every quiet humiliation he'd swallowed to keep the lights on. The world had taken so much from them, but here, by this creek and these old walls, they'd built something no one could price. A moth circled the lamp, casting fleeting shadows over the drawing. Nate leaned back and let the sound of the creek fill the silence again. He pictured the wheel turning slowly, the first paddle dipping into current, the first shimmer of power humming through wire. It wouldn't be much, a single bulb, maybe two, but he could already imagine June's face when it lit. That look children had when they saw proof that effort mattered, that things broken could still work again. He smiled at the thought, tired and content in a way that didn't need words. The night creaked and breathed around him, wood settling, water moving, the world waiting. Nate closed his eyes and listened to the rhythm of the place, the same one that had started to match his own heartbeat. Tomorrow he'd dig deeper, tighten the fittings, scrape the rust, and make good on what he'd said. Because sometimes a promise wasn't about what it bought. It was about who it made you become while keeping it. The creek was low that morning, but it moved with purpose, a silver thread winding through the stones. Nate had been up since dawn, tightening bolts on the makeshift axle he'd rebuilt from a truck drive shaft. The air smelled of wet metal and cedar. June crouched on the bank, her chin resting on her knees, eyes wide as if watching a magician at work. "Is it going to work?" she asked for the 10th time. Nate smiled without looking up. Only one way to find out. He'd scavenged every piece from the edges of town, a rusted alternator from Leroy's shed, belt drives from an old mower, wooden paddles cut from broken siding. It wasn't pretty. But then again, neither was hope most of the time. It just had to move. He gave the wheel one last check, fingers tracing the notches where water would catch. The creek burbled beside him, low and teasing. "All right," he murmured. "Let's see if you remember how to turn." He loosened the rope, holding it steady. For a moment nothing happened. The paddles dipped into the slow current and rocked once, twice, as if deciding. Then, with a groan that rose into a creak, the wheel turned. June gasped. "It's moving!" The rhythm was uneven, slow, but steady, the wheel catching water, lifting, dropping, pushing. The belt stretched, then caught. The alternator whined softly, the sound delicate but alive. Nate followed the wire with his eyes, up through the cracked window, where it fed into the small bulb he'd hung above the doorway. For a second, nothing. Then the filament inside flickered, hesitated, and finally bloomed into light. Not bright, not steady, just a fragile orange glow. But it was there. June's cheer split the quiet, sharp enough to send sparrows bursting from the trees. "It works! Dad, it really works!" She spun in circles on the bank, clapping her hands. The reflection of the lamp shimmered in the creek, like a star that had decided to come down and see for itself. Nate stood still, his throat tight. He'd expected satisfaction, but what came instead was something softer, a quiet awe that soaked straight through him. The wheel kept turning, whispering against the current. The belt hummed, the lamp breathed. He crouched beside June, watching her eyes glow with the same orange as the light. "That," he said, pointing to the lamp, "is what happens when you don't give up." She grinned. "So, can we run the toaster next?" He laughed, the sound breaking loose after weeks of strain. "Let's start small, kid." Light before toast. They stayed there as the sun climbed, the bulb's glow paling against the daylight but refusing to die. Every rotation of the wheel felt like a pulse, a heartbeat syncing with theirs. By the time the creek's shadow shortened, Nate knew the truth of it. This wasn't just the first spin of a machine, it was the first breath of a place remembering what it was built to do. And for a man who'd been running on scraps of luck and stubbornness, that small light was enough to make the whole world look new again. The next morning, Rosa arrived with a stack of papers bound in twine and smelling faintly of mildew and thyme. She'd found them tucked in a metal cabinet behind the old office door. Minutes from the Riverbridge co-op board meetings, yellowed at the edges, the ink fading but legible enough to whisper. She spread them carefully across the counter where Nate had been sanding a window frame. "Look at this," she said, tapping one with her finger. 1979. Nate leaned in, brushing sawdust off his arm. The handwriting was neat, slanted. Someone had taken care with these words. The heading read, "No one goes hungry on Riverbridge Road." Beneath it were paragraphs describing night shifts, volunteers, and flour rations distributed during a winter when the feed plant had shut down. Names filled the margins. Farmers, widows, families he recognized in pieces, surnames still echoing in town. "Ran all night, just to grind grain for people laid off," Rosa murmured. "They took turns watching the water wheel so it wouldn't freeze." Nate traced the faded pencil marks beside the entries. Notations of deliveries, signatures, the looping initials of people long gone. His throat tightened. "They didn't make much," he said, voice low. "But they made enough for everyone else." Rosa nodded. The co-op wasn't about profit. It was about pride. They kept dignity alive when the mills went dark. Outside, the creek gurgled against the stones, as if it had been listening the whole time. Nate turned toward it, hearing the water in a new way now, like a ghost repeating an old promise. He thought of the light they'd sparked the day before, that single bulb glowing like a heartbeat in the dark. For the first time, he understood what it meant. It wasn't just invention or survival, it was continuation. The people in those minutes hadn't disappeared. They'd just been waiting for someone to pick up where they left off. Rosa handed him another page. They voted to call themselves a cooperative instead of a company, she said, so everyone could share in the work, even if they couldn't pay. Listen to this part. We grind so no one goes hungry. That was their motto. The phrase hit him harder than he expected. He could almost hear his own voice saying it to June, about promises, about light, about making something live again. He smiled faintly, shaking his head. We've been rebuilding their dream without even knowing it. Or maybe, Rosa said, folding the papers back into their bundle, it knew how to find you. Nate watched her leave with the records pressed to her chest. The air in the mill felt charged, alive with stories that hadn't been told in decades. He looked toward the wheel, still turning slow and steady outside, and felt the weight of those words settle deep in him. No one goes hungry. It wasn't a slogan. It was an inheritance written in calloused hands and creek water. And now, it was his turn to keep it moving. The morning smelled like rain and fresh-cut grass when the SUV rolled up the dirt path. It stopped just shy of the mill porch, tires spitting gravel. Nate wiped his hands on a rag and watched as the man stepped out. Sharp suit, polished shoes, not a trace of dust on him. "Mr. Carver, I presume?" the stranger said, flashing a smile meant to look friendly but landing somewhere near practiced. Gavin Pike, Pike Development Group. Nate nodded once, slow. "You're blocking the creek." Gavin laughed lightly, as if they were sharing a private joke. "You've been busy here. Word gets around." He gestured at the water wheel, at the new planks patching the siding. "Quite the restoration project." "It's coming along." Gavin pulled a folder from under his arm, the kind that smelled faintly of ink and leverage. "I'll get right to it. My firm's been acquiring parcels along the river for a new residential project, Riverfront Vista. Luxury townhomes, walking paths, cafes. Very modern. This old mill happens to sit on prime land." June appeared in the doorway, clutching a wrench half her size. Nate gave her a small shake of his head, and she disappeared back inside. "Don't think this property is zoned for that," Nate said. Gavin smiled again, tighter this time. "That's where we come in. The council's very motivated. We can make zoning flexible. You'd get a tidy sum, well above market value. It's a win-win." Nate leaned against the railing. "For who?" "For you, of course," Gavin said, tone too smooth. "You've put in a lot of elbow grease, but let's be honest. This place is a relic, and relics don't pay the bills." The creek hissed softly behind them, water sliding through the wheel paddles. Nate stared at it for a long moment. "Funny," he said. "That relic's been keeping lights on for weeks." Gavin followed his gaze, feigning interest. "A novelty, sure, but this property could be worth hundreds of thousands, maybe more, if developed properly. I'm offering you a way out before this turns into a money pit." Nate didn't move. He folded his rag, tucked it in his back pocket, and looked Gavin square in the eye. "We're not for sale." The smile cracked then, just slightly. "Mr. Carver, I don't think you understand the kind of opportunity—" "I do," Nate cut in. "You're here to pave over history and call it progress. I've seen what happens next. People priced out, the town hollowed for profit. You call it growth. I call it forgetting." For a moment, only the creek answered. Gavin's expression cooled. "You're making a mistake." "Maybe," Nate said, "but it'll be mine to make." Gavin slid his folder back under his arm and adjusted his cuffs. "Don't take too long to reconsider. This offer won't stay open." As the SUV reversed down the path, June peeked out again. "Who was that?" "Someone who doesn't know what this place means," Nate said. He looked at the slow-turning wheel, the faint hum of current meeting motion. "And someone who never will." The wind shifted, carrying the smell of wet cedar and engine exhaust. But beneath it all, the creek kept whispering, steady, alive, unbought. By the time the rejection letter came back from the county office, Nate already knew what it said. The envelope was too thin for good news. He opened it anyway, standing by the workbench while June did her homework on a crate beside him. The official language was polite, precise, and utterly deflating. Application incomplete. Floodplain variance required prior to stabilization permit. Rosa sighed when she read it. Bureaucracy loves a loop. That night, the mill's small office became their war room. Rosa rolled in a whiteboard from her truck and drew a grid in blue marker. She labeled each square with words that sounded like riddles: stabilization, floodplain, inspection, environmental review. Beneath each, she listed deadlines in red. Okay, she said, pointing at the chaos. We do this step before the next one can exist. It's like dominoes, but slower. Nate nodded, though his eyes were unfocused. And if we miss one deadline? They fine us, she said flatly, or toss it back to the start. June spun lazily on an old stool. Can I draw the wheel on the corner? Go ahead, Rosa said. It's the only thing that makes sense around here. Nate spent the next morning in the library printing out forms from the county website. They came out in a crooked stack, pages curling, every paragraph filled with words that could break a man's will. Liability, compliance, hydrological certification. He didn't know what half of it meant. He read them aloud under his breath anyway, like learning a new language built to keep people out. Mrs. Alvarez stopped by with sandwiches. You building or fighting? She asked. Nate smiled weakly. Both, I think. He spread the papers across the counter, tracing the steps with his finger. Rosa's whiteboard hung nearby, now crowded with arrows and sticky notes. We'll need an engineer's sign-off, she said. I might know someone who volunteers with Habitat. She owes me a favor. The thought of asking for help again tightened something in Nate's chest, but he nodded. Do it. As the days passed, the mill turned into a hybrid of construction site and filing office. Nails and sawdust shared space with binders and forms. Rosa handled the calls. Nate built the framework for a walkway required by code. June labeled folders in purple marker. Permits, receipts, maybe someday. At night, when the wheel outside slowed to its moonlit crawl, Nate would sit by the lamp and fill out one line at a time, signature, date, parcel number, until the words blurred. He wasn't sure if the effort mattered, but he kept writing. Rosa stopped by one evening with coffee and a tired grin. You're getting good at this. Good at pretending I know what I'm doing, he said. She laughed. That's all anyone ever does when they build something new. The creek hummed through the open window, and Nate looked at the papers again. They were just forms, but together they meant progress. Slow, stubborn, and real. The inspector showed up on a Thursday morning, the kind of day where the air felt too clean for bad news. He was a compact man with a clipboard and a voice that carried authority without volume. His vest was spotless, his hard hat new enough to squeak. You must be Mr. Carver, he said. Floodplain inspection, safety review, phase 1. Nate wiped his hands on his jeans and nodded. That's me. Watch your step. Decking's not all fastened yet. The man raised an eyebrow and made a note. That's actually one of the items we'll need to address. For the next hour, he prowled the mill like a detective at a crime scene. He tapped beams, checked bolts, measured gaps, and scribbled more notes than seemed humanly possible. June trailed behind him with a clipboard of her own, pretending to take notes too. Rosa watched from near the door, arms folded, whispering to Nate when the inspector moved out of earshot. He looks like the kind of guy who alphabetizes his cereal. Nate gave her a half smile, then turned back to the man in the vest. By the end of the tour, the list was long. Loose decking on the east platform, unsecured machinery along the north wall, no safety guard on that auger. Electrical conduit needs inspection before reconnection, and the railing by the wheel, missing 2 slats. The words landed like stones, but Nate didn't flinch. He'd expected worse. The inspector snapped his folder shut. I know it's a lot, but I've seen worse. It's not unsalvageable, just needs attention. Rosa stepped forward. You mean it's fixable? Everything's fixable, he said, as long as you do it by the book. When he drove away, the sound of his tires faded into the hum of the creek. The quiet that followed wasn't defeat, it was focus. Nate stood still for a moment, hands in his pockets, eyes scanning the old boards and rusted bolts. June broke the silence first. He said it's not unsalvageable. That's a compliment, right? High praise, Nate said, from a man who color codes his pens. That night they started tackling the list. Rosa found scrap metal for the missing guard, and Nate tore out every rotten plank on the east deck until the boards lay in neat piles like bones ready to be set right. June fetched nails and counted them aloud just to keep pace with the rhythm of the hammer. By midnight, the railing stood straight again. The auger had a new cover, welded from an old truck fender. Nate leaned against the doorway, drenched in sweat and sawdust, but smiling. "Think he'd pass us now?" Rosa asked. "Not yet," Nate said, tightening one more bolt. "But next time, he'll have fewer boxes to tick." June yawned, curling up on the step. "We're gonna fix everything, huh?" Nate looked at her, then at the lamp flickering over the steady wheel. "Everything that matters," he said. And for the first time in a long while, the word safe didn't sound like something other people got to have. It sounded like something they were building, piece by piece, right here. The phone call came on a Sunday afternoon, just as Nate was scraping mud from the wheel paddles. He almost didn't answer. Numbers with area codes he didn't recognize usually meant bills or bad news, but he wiped his hands on a rag and picked up. "Hey, cousin," came a voice both familiar and smug. "It's Travis." Been a long time. Nate remembered the last time they'd spoken, 5 years ago at a wedding, when Travis had bragged about his third rental property. "Yeah," Nate said. "Been busy. I can tell. Word's gotten around you're living out at the old mill. That true?" Nate didn't answer right away. He glanced at June, sitting cross-legged near the creek, drawing something in the dirt with a stick. "We're fixing it up," Travis laughed. "Fixing it up, that's one way to put it. Nate, come on. You've got a little girl. You can't raise her in a place like that. I'm just worried, man." Nate tightened his jaw. "She's fine." "I'm sure you're doing your best," Travis said, his tone slipping into the syrupy cadence of concern that wasn't concern at all. "But think about what she's missing: steady power, clean water, safety. I could pull some strings, get you into something better. There's a complex on the north side, good schools, security gates, real community." "Real community," Nate said. "You mean people who don't know their neighbors' names?" There was a pause. "You're being defensive." "I'm offering help." "No," Nate said. "You're offering distance. You want us somewhere that fits your idea of safe." "Safe is where a roof doesn't leak," Travis shot back. "Where a kid doesn't have to sleep next to a toolbox." Nate looked at June again. She was holding a handful of creek stones, arranging them in a pattern shaped like a wheel. Her hair glowed gold in the late sun. "Safety isn't a zip code," he said quietly. "It's knowing your kid can look at you and see someone who doesn't quit." Travis sighed. "You've always been stubborn. And you've always measured worth by square footage." The line went quiet long enough that Nate thought the call had dropped. Then Travis muttered, "You could have been something, you know. You were smart." Nate smiled without humor. "Still am." He hung up before the silence could turn heavy. When he turned back to the mill, June waved her creation proudly. "Look, Dad, it spins if the water hits it right." He crouched beside her, helping align the stones. Together they watched the miniature wheel catch the current and turn once, twice, then steady into motion. "Guess it works," she said. Nate nodded. "Guess it does." The phone buzzed again on the porch, but he didn't move to answer. The creek whispered, the wheel turned, and for the first time all week, the only sound that mattered was laughter, his and June's, carried clean through the valley air. It started with a sound, soft, irregular, like paper being torn somewhere in the dark. Nate woke before dawn, the faint rhythm of rain against the tin roof blending with something else, sharper. He sat up on the cot, heart already alert, and listened. Then he heard the crunch of footsteps on gravel, quick and retreating. By the time he grabbed the flashlight and stepped outside, the night had gone still again. The beam cut across the yard, empty. The tarp that had covered the supplies flapped in the wind, shredded along one edge. He ran to it. The buckets, nails, and tools were still there. But the whiteboard, the one Rosa had brought, filled with their hard-earned notes, deadlines, and permit progress, was gone. He stood frozen, staring at the pale rectangle of dust where it used to hang. The rain picked up, faint and cold, tracing down his forearms. Rosa arrived 10 minutes later, headlights slicing through the mist. She climbed out of her truck and saw his face before he said a word. What happened? They took it. What, the generator? No. The plan. She followed his gaze, jaw tightening. The tarp hung limp beside the wheel, its corner sliced clean through. Whoever had done it wasn't scavenging for scrap. They were sending a message. Nothing else gone? He shook his head. Just the board. They checked every corner, every shadowed edge of the property. The rain softened to drizzle, but the air stayed heavy with unease. Inside, June sat on her sleeping bag, clutching her sketchbook. Dad, was it animals? He forced a smile. No, sweetheart. Just a mean wind. She didn't believe it, not entirely, but nodded anyway. After she fell asleep again, Nate sat on the stoop with Rosa, watching the faint glow of the water wheel through the fog. It's him, Rosa said finally. That developer. Pike. You know it is. Nate exhaled. Maybe. Or someone he paid. You going to call the sheriff? And say what? That someone stole a dry erase board? Silence settled between them, broken only by the creak. Rosa rubbed her palms together, her voice low. They want you to quit. Make it feel like the ground under you isn't steady. Nate's jaw flexed. Then we anchor harder. The next morning, he replaced the whiteboard with a sheet of plywood. He drew the same boxes and arrows in thick black marker, rougher but bolder. Rosa added her notes back from memory. June wrote in purple crayon at the top, "Don't give up." The board stood crooked and smudged, but it held. That night, when the wheel turned under the moonlight, its reflection looked stronger than before, like defiance given shape. Nate watched the water spin and thought, you can cut a tarp, but you can't cut what it covers. He wasn't angry anymore, just certain. If they'd come to frighten him off, they'd chosen the wrong man and the wrong mill. Morning began with metal and resolve. Nate drove lag screws into new hasps on the doors, the drill whining as shavings curled up like tiny silver ribbons. He set a chain through the handles and tested the lock, tugging hard until the wood groaned but held. Inside, he bolted a steel hasp across the office door and added a second padlock to the tool cabinet. He was not building a fortress. He was teaching the mill to close its eyes when it slept. Rosa arrived with a thermos and a bag of screws. She watched him work without commentary, passing him hardware like a surgical nurse. When he finished the last hasp, she set the thermos on the counter and nodded once, approving. Their talk was simple and practical. If fear lived here last night, it did not belong to the morning. On the plywood where the whiteboard had been, Nate uncapped a thick marker and rewrote their plan from memory. He did not bother with the delicate weaving of steps they had argued over for weeks. He wrote it large and spare, leaving no room for doubt. Shore the east deck, guard the auger, rail the wheel, submit the floodplain packet, schedule inspection, open the doors. He stepped back. The words looked like a path through tall grass, cut straight and clean. Rosa added dates beside each line, then boxed them in with a firmer hand than before. June stood on tiptoe to see, her hair still wild from sleep. "Can I help?" she asked. He handed her a sheet of paper and tape. She disappeared to her backpack and returned with a handful of small stickers she had been saving, the kind teachers gave out for good work. She placed one next to each step and spoke them aloud as if naming stars. Wheel, lights, shelves, open. With each sticker, the board seemed to breathe a little deeper. They chained the heavier tools to a beam, threading the links through handles, the way sailors tie knots that will not slip. Nate marked the saw blades with paint, labeled the boxes, put the bolts back in the same coffee can every time. Order did not win fights, but it saved time, and time was the only currency they had. At noon, Leroy dropped off conduit and a rusted hasp from his shop that still had life left in it. He grunted at the new locks, satisfied. "A man does not keep what he will not secure," he said, and waved off thanks. The afternoon turned to steady effort. Nate rebuilt the missing rail slats by the wheel, each board planed smooth to keep little hands safe. Rosa called the county about inspection windows and wrote a name on the board beside the word schedule. June sorted the donated shelf brackets on a blanket and arranged them into pairs like puzzle pieces. When Nate paused to drink water, he caught her staring at the plan again, lips moving as she rehearsed the steps. By dusk, the mill felt tighter, truer. The chain on the door clicked with a clean certainty. The plan on the plywood glowed in the lamplight like a map that finally believed in its destination. June pressed one last sticker at the bottom corner and patted it into place. "Open," she said, smiling. "Not someday. Soon." "Soon," Nate answered, and meant it. The wheel murmured outside, and the sound was not defiance now. It was continuity. It was a list, written in water, turning. The first envelope arrived on a Monday, pale and official, with a window that showed Nate's name printed too neatly. He opened it by the workbench, June watching with curious eyes. Warning, it said, for unpermitted alterations and failure to post a visible hazard notice. The second came Wednesday, handwritten, a concerned citizen urging the county to look into drainage issues caused by unauthorized water wheel activity. By Friday, the mailbox held a stack of paper like a small white wall against the day. Rosa sorted them on the desk, lips pressed thin. Most were copy and paste threats, the kind that used big words to make small men louder. One complaint accused them of diverting the creek, another claimed rats had increased in the area, another warned that children were seen playing near industrial equipment. June read that one and looked wounded, as if the paper itself had lied about her. Nate put a hand on her shoulder. "Paper can say anything," he said. "It is not the same as truth." They did not throw the letters away. Rosa made folders, she wrote dates, and logged who sent what. Where a signature appeared, she circled it in pencil and looked up addresses. Where the letters hid behind anonymity, she marked them as noise, but kept them all the same. "We reply to everything," she said. "We do not give anyone the silence they hope for." In the afternoons, while Nate planned and braced and tightened, Rosa drafted responses. She cited the inspector's first visit and the corrective steps taken. She attached photos of new railing slats, the auger guard, the posted caution signs. She requested clarification on the drainage claim and enclosed a simple diagram to show that the wheel returned water to the same channel it took it from. She wrote clean, firm sentences that did not apologize for existing. Then she turned to Nate. "You have to speak at the permit board next week." He stared at her. "I am not good at that." "You are good at telling the truth," she said. "That is the only part that matters." Every evening after June fell asleep, they practiced in the office. Rosa placed 3 chairs in a row and sat behind them like a panel. She made a game of it at first, asking Nate to start with his name, the mill's address, the purpose of the request. He spoke too fast the first time, too loud the second, then too quiet. She showed him where to pause, where to breathe. She made him say the hard words until they felt like his. Stabilization, variance, floodplain. She taught him to anchor every sentence with what the board could verify. Photos, dates, the inspector's checklist with items crossed off in ink. He asked what to say when they asked why he was doing this. She smiled. "Tell them the ledger you found. Tell them what it said. No one goes hungry on Riverbridge Road. Tell them that line did not disappear just because the door rotted off its hinges." By the end of the week, his voice found its own pace. Slow, steady, the way the wheel turned when the creek ran true. The mailbox still filled with paper bullets, but they did not sting as much. At night he would stand under the lamplight and look at the folders stacked in order, at the plan Rosa had taped to the wall, at June asleep with a pencil in her hand. The world could throw its letters all day. Tomorrow he would answer with the only thing that mattered: work, proof, and a voice that did not shake. The community hall smelled faintly of coffee and old varnish. Folding chairs scraped the linoleum as people settled in, murmuring about potholes, school budgets, and the Riverbridge mill, the last item on the agenda. Nate sat near the back, hands clasped so tight his knuckles were white. Beside him, Rosa whispered, "Remember, just speak steady. Don't let him turn this into a performance." At the front, under humming fluorescent lights, Gavin Pike smoothed his jacket and began. His voice carried with the easy confidence of a man who'd practiced. "Friends, we all want safety and progress," he said, gesturing toward a blown-up rendering of shiny riverfront condos. "That old mill is a hazard. A decaying structure sitting on floodplain soil, right next to where our children play. My firm can bring life back to this area. Clean water access, jobs, housing, real revitalization." Several heads nodded. Others looked uncertain. Rosa leaned forward, jaw tight. Nate's pulse hammered in his ears. Pike continued, "Now I respect Mr. Carver's enthusiasm, but we must be realistic. His project lacks permits, safety oversight, and funding. Sentiment doesn't build community. Investment does laughter rippled in the back row, the polite kind that wounds more than mockery." The chairperson cleared his throat. "Mr. Carver, would you like to respond?" Nate rose slowly, paper trembling in his hand. He didn't look at Pike. He looked at the rows of faces, neighbors, some he'd cooked breakfast for at the diner, some who'd dropped off nails and tarps when no one was watching. "I'm not a developer," he began, voice rough but steady. "I'm a father, and I'm trying to fix something that was built to help people long before anyone here had a title deed." He unfolded a yellowed sheet from his folder, the ledger page, copied carefully from the old book. "I found this in the mill's office. It lists families who came there when the mines closed, when the store shelves were empty. People paid in eggs, or flour, or not at all. And next to every entry someone wrote, 'No one goes hungry on Riverbridge Road.'" The hall grew quiet. Nate's throat tightened, but he kept going. "Last month, we turned the wheel again. Just one light came on, one bulb, but it was enough to see June's face. That's my daughter. She said it looked like the mill was breathing again." His hands stopped shaking. "That place isn't a hazard. It's a reminder of what this town used to do best. Take care of each other when no one else would." He set the paper on the podium. "I don't have investors. I have people who show up. And that's worth more to this place than any check." For a moment, no one spoke. Then Rosa started clapping, once sharp. Mrs. Alvarez joined in. Leroy followed. A few hesitant hands rose, then more. The applause was uneven, careful, but real. Pike's smile thinned. The chairperson nodded, tapping his pen against the folder. "Thank you, Mr. Carver. We'll review both proposals." When Nate sat down, his hands were still trembling, but not from fear. The light above flickered once, steadied and stayed on. They posted the agenda on a corkboard outside the chamber door, a neat line of items, ending with Riverbridge Mill. The room smelled of dust and coffee when the board returned from a short recess and took their seats. Nate sat between Rosa and June, hands flat on his knees, staring at the microphones like they were small, uncertain bridges. Gavin Pike leaned against the back wall, expression unreadable, a man used to waiting for outcomes he usually controlled. The chair cleared his throat. "The Riverbridge application. We have reviewed the floodplain reports, the initial safety notes from inspection, and public comment." He paused as if measuring his words. "This is not a simple matter." A woman 2 seats down adjusted her glasses. "Mr. Carver, your presentation and the documentation from the first inspection were thorough. The intent of your project is commendable. However, there are ongoing risks that require oversight." Rosa's fingers brushed Nate's sleeve, a quiet reminder to breathe. June squeezed his other hand. The chair continued. "The board will issue a conditional stabilization permit for a period of 90 days. During this window, you will complete the listed safety items, submit photographs and receipts, and agree to 2 follow-up inspections. Any violation will void the permit." The words settled like small stones. Not a fireworks moment, not defeat either. Permission to keep trying. Rosa stood. "Thank you," she said simply. "We accept the conditions." Gavin stepped forward, voice smooth. "If I may, will the board also consider placing a moratorium on public events at the site during the window, given the outstanding issues?" The woman with the glasses nodded. "Yes, no public gatherings until the second inspection. "Mr. Carver, that includes bake sales, tours, anything that invites a crowd." Nate rose. "Understood. We have no events planned, we are still building." The chair tapped his pen. "Then we are agreed. 90 days. The board wishes you well in meeting the requirements." The gavel came down with a soft, almost apologetic thud. Conversations resumed, chairs scraped, people stood. Gavin gave Nate a courteous nod that did not reach his eyes, and left without another word. Leroy clapped Nate's shoulder on his way past. "Not a no," he said. "That's something." Outside, the sun had slipped behind the courthouse roofline, leaving the parking lot washed in thin evening light. June ran ahead to the truck and turned back, grinning. "We get to keep going." "We do," Nate said. Back at the mill, they tacked the permit inside the office door with 4 pushpins and stood looking at it as if it might shift. Rosa drew a new column on the plywood plan and wrote the dates. Week 1, railings. Week 2, decking. Week 3, conduit inspection. She underlined the last line twice. Second inspection. Nate sharpened a pencil and numbered the tasks. The marks were darker than before, more deliberate. He felt tired down to his bones. But it was a good tired, the kind that asked for a list and a morning. They ate sandwiches on the porch steps while the water wheel turned, slow and faithful, its reflection wobbling in the creek. No music, no speeches, just the sound of moving water and paper rustling as Rosa slid forms into labeled folders. 90 days, June said, mouth full. "That is 3 months?" 90 days, Nate answered. "Enough time to prove this place can stand. Enough time to keep his promise." He watched the lamp glow against the dark and let the quiet do what it does best. It steadied him. It said, "Begin again." Saturday began before sunrise. The gravel lot outside the mill filled with pickup trucks, hatchbacks, and bicycles. People carrying hammers, thermoses, and good intentions. Nate stood by the porch rail, almost disbelieving it. The so-called abandoned property was suddenly the town's busiest corner. Mrs. Alvarez arrived first with her sons, who hauled 2x6s from the bed of a truck. Then came the high school shop class, still smelling faintly of machine oil and cafeteria pancakes. Rosa brought coffee from the community center, her sleeves rolled up, her energy already setting the pace. A retired carpenter named Walt unfolded a canvas tool roll like a magician showing his deck. "Let's see if this old place still knows how to stand straight," he said, grinning. By 8 o'clock, the air throbbed with rhythm, hammer taps, laughter, the scrape of nails pulled and replaced. The deck that once bent under its own weight began to even out under new boards. June swept between the workers, ferrying screws and sandwiches, her 2 big gloves flapping like flags. Someone tuned a small radio, and an old country song leaked out through static, the kind that sounds better outdoors. When a plank fit snug, Nate ran his palm along it and nodded. He wasn't used to help that asked for nothing in return. Every time he turned, another hand had picked up where he'd left off. The same town that once laughed at him now measured joists and carried lumber like believers rebuilding a chapel. Rosa kept a running checklist on her clipboard. Guardrails, done. Decking, halfway. Storefront, next. She barked orders with the gentle authority of someone who'd organized too many bake sales to be intimidated by wood and nails. At noon, the baker from downtown pulled up with boxes of glazed rolls and a new pot of coffee. "Payment for future electricity," he joked, setting the boxes down. June handed out pastries like currency. Even the teens, who had come mostly to earn extra credit, smiled between bites, faces dusted with sawdust and sugar. Someone painted the storefront that afternoon, a deep barn red that glowed like iron in sunlight. It wasn't perfect, the brush marks showed, and a few drips streaked the lower boards, but it looked alive. Nate stepped back, squinting at the color. "What do you think?" he asked. June tilted her head. "It looks like the mill's heart." He couldn't have said it better. By evening, the wheel stood newly braced, wrapped with a guardrail that caught the last gold of the day. They all gathered near it, Rosa, Walt, the students, the teachers, the baker, even 2 city clerks who had come just to check progress. The creek moved beneath them, whispering through the spokes. Not bad for a condemned property, Rosa said. Nate smiled. Dirt streaked down his cheek. Not bad at all. They didn't have a grand reopening, no ribbon or speeches, just people leaning on their tools, sharing a quiet pride that hummed louder than any machine. When night came, the bulb above the door flickered to life, drawing moths and lighting up the red paint like embers. The mill, for the first time in decades, looked ready for tomorrow. The new wheel turned smoother now, each wooden paddle slicing the creek with patient rhythm. The alternator hummed, a sound less like machinery and more like breathing. Inside, warmth gathered, the kind that came not from wires or gas but from people moving with shared purpose. By late afternoon, the old storage room smelled like dough and anticipation. Rosa stood over a flour-dusted counter, sleeves rolled, while June measured sugar with the precision of a scientist. Bags of donated grain lined the wall, each marked with the same words in thick marker from the Riverbridge Co-op, a circle completed half a century late. Nate leaned against the doorframe, watching the grinder spin. The machine was small, ugly and perfect. It had been hauled in by Walt, the retired carpenter, who'd found it rusting behind the school gym. He'd rebuilt the casing and jury-rigged a belt system to the generator. When the first handful of grain fell in and the first dust of flour drifted out, people clapped as if they'd witnessed a birth. "Try it," Rosa said, handing Nate a handful of dough to knead. He hesitated, then pushed his palms into it. The texture reminded him of simpler things, work that stayed done, warmth you could hold. June giggled as flour coated his arms. "You look like a snowman, Dad." The baker from downtown arrived near dusk with trays of dough and a small portable oven that wheezed but worked. He shook Nate's hand. "Electricity's clean," he said, "and the flour smells alive. You can't buy that kind of freshness." Soon the air filled with the smell of bread. Neighbors filtered in, drawn by scent and laughter. They brought whatever they had, apples, butter, jam. Someone strummed a guitar. The hum of the wheel outside kept time like a slow metronome. When the first loaves came out, golden and uneven, June tore off a piece and blew on it. "We made this," she said. "From the river," Nate smiled. "From everyone." Rosa raised a mug of coffee. "To everyone, then." The room echoed with agreement, spoons clinking, voices overlapping in the easy way of people who'd forgotten to stay strangers. The tables were mismatched and the chairs creaked, but the place felt full in a way no blueprint could measure. After cleanup, Nate stepped outside. The windows glowed soft amber against the night, and the wheels spun on, steady, tireless, faithful. He could see their shadows moving inside. June chasing Rosa with a dish towel, Walt adjusting a hinge, someone laughing near the oven. He thought of how it started, with mockery, with an empty bank account, with a roof that barely held. Now the same walls whispered gratitude every time the wheel turned. He pulled his coat tighter and looked at the creek glimmering under the moon. The mill didn't just make light anymore, it made belonging. It made proof that a place could wake again when people decided it should. And inside, the smell of bread lingered, warm, sweet, defiant, and alive. The reopening didn't look like a grand event. No podium, no ribbon, just a hand-painted sign propped against the porch rail. Riverbridge Co-op, pay what you can. Rosa's brushstrokes were uneven but proud. Nate had tried to protest that it looked too small, but she'd said, if people come for the bread, they'll see the sign. If they come for the sign, they'll stay for the bread. By noon, they were out of space in the lot again. Word had spread, quietly, the way good things do when they feel earned. A farmer brought 2 sacks of rye and a bucket of honey. A teacher carried in jars of homemade jam, apologizing that the labels were smudged. A group of teenagers wheeled in a dolly loaded with empty jars to refill. Everyone brought something that wasn't money, but meant just as much. June sat at a table near the door with a box labeled Donations or Stories. Some people dropped bills, others dropped notes. Memories of the old mill and what it had been. My mother got her flour here during the strike of '79. Dad said this place kept our town fed when the grocery trucks stopped. My grandmother said she could smell bread all the way to the bridge. Inside, the air shimmered with flour dust and light. The grinder hummed in the back, the alternator kept steady, and the bulb over the counter flickered warm against the red-painted walls. Rosa managed a rotation. 3 at the grinder, 2 kneading, 1 packing, 1 sweeping. Nate kept stepping aside so others could take over. He realized it was working best when he did less. People laughed, like they were remembering how. Someone tuned a guitar again, and a child banged on a bucket for percussion. The rhythm caught, spreading through the crowd like the hum of the wheel outside. Mrs. Alvarez appeared with trays of empanadas. "The first batch of flowers for everyone who built it," she said. Nate tried to argue, but she waved him off. "You eat, or I'll tell Rosa." Rosa laughed from across the room. "She means it." They ate standing, leaning on door frames and barrels, the river whispering beyond the open windows. The same water that had once threatened to wash the place away now powered its heartbeat. When the grinder finally slowed, Nate shut it off and listened. He hadn't realized how loud it had been until the silence arrived, thick, gentle, full. He looked around, the walls painted, shelves lined, people talking. The co-op was breathing again. June tugged his sleeve. "Dad, they don't need us anymore." He knelt to meet her eyes. "That's the point, kiddo." As dusk fell, the sign outside caught the last orange light of day. "Pay what you can," gleamed like a promise that didn't expire. People left carrying sacks, jars, loaves, and something harder to name. Something that felt like belonging wrapped in paper. Nate stood on the porch, hands in his pockets, watching the wheel turn steady under the moon. The creek kept whispering its same old tune. Keep going, keep going, keep going. By September, the mill no longer felt like a miracle. It felt like muscle memory. The red paint had faded a little in the sun. The door hinges squeaked again, and the sign out front had been touched up twice already. But inside, the rhythm never stopped. On Tuesdays, a class of middle schoolers came for what the science teacher called practical physics. They'd crowd around the windowed wheel room, while Nate explained how water pressure pushed the paddles, turning motion into electricity. The kids would lean close, eyes wide, and one of them always asked, "So it's free power?" Nate smiled the same way every time. "Nothing's free," he said, "but some things pay you back differently." June stood nearby, clutching her clipboard. She had started something called the Wheel Keepers Club, a name she painted herself on cardboard and hung near the tool rack. Every afternoon, she and 3 other kids logged the wheel's turns, water flow, and hours of operation. Their entries filled a binder Rosa donated, labeled with stickers and smudged fingerprints. It wasn't official data, but it mattered. When the students left, parents stayed behind, often bringing leftovers or spare groceries. Someone would set a pot of chili on the counter, someone else left apples, bread, soup jars. A shelf by the door became a swap spot. One day, a note appeared above it in careful handwriting. "Take what you need, leave what you can." By the next morning, a wooden crate had joined the shelf. 2 days later, another. The little pantry grew without permission and no one questioned it. Mrs. Alvarez managed the jars like inventory, and Walt built a proper frame for them. Rosa called it a kindness machine. Nate didn't argue. He just kept patching leaks and tightening bolts, making sure the hum of the generator stayed steady. He liked that no one asked whose idea it was anymore. Everything belonged to everyone. The kids' laughter echoed from the loft where the old flower chute used to drop. They'd turned it into a sort of headquarters, maps, drawings, and a big chart where June tracked wheel hours. She'd announced one morning that the goal was to keep it turning for 100 straight days. "If the creek helps," she said, "we can too." Nate looked up at her from below, remembering the night she first called the mill's heart alive. Back then it had been just the 2 of them. Now there were 50 hands turning wrenches, baking bread, painting signs, explaining science, and tending shelves. One evening, after everyone had gone, he flipped the switch that dimmed the lights. The sound of the creek slipped through the cracks again, constant, calm. June stood beside him, her notebook under her arm. "We did good today," she said. He nodded. "We did." She leaned against him. "Not just us." He smiled into the dark. That's the best part. Outside, the wheel turned on, slow and steady, drawing power from the river, feeding it back into the town, an endless trade between motion and meaning. Before dawn, the mill was all shadow and breath. The creek whispered, low and steady, and the faint hum of the wheel turned through the fog like a heartbeat too gentle to wake the world. Nate sat at the wooden table near the window, an oil lamp flickering beside a scrap of paper. His coffee had gone cold. He didn't notice. He'd been staring at the blank page for a long time, searching for something that felt like an ending, or at least a way to pass on what mattered most. June was still asleep in the loft, one arm thrown over her notebook. Her wheelkeeper's chart hung crooked beside her, the inked line marking 99 days of continuous motion. Tomorrow would make 100. He picked up his pen and wrote slowly, the words coming like the wheel itself, steady, deliberate, no rush. Wood ages, water carves, purpose endures. He paused, listening to the creak, to the faint creak of the paddles turning. Keep the wheel turning for everyone. He folded the paper and slid it beneath her clipboard, weighing it down with a small river stone they'd found together on the first week they moved in. She had called it lucky because it was shaped like a heart. Outside, the air was damp and cool. He stepped onto the porch, boots creaking against the boards he'd sanded himself. The red paint caught only a hint of the coming sun. The sign, Riverbridge Co-op, pay what you can, leaned slightly from the last storm, and he smiled at the imperfection. It made the place feel alive. The water wheel spun slow and sure, droplets flashing when the first light hit them. Every turn sent a ripple through the mill's reflection, blurring and reforming in the current. The sound had become the pulse of his days, the rhythm that replaced exhaustion with purpose. Behind him the door opened. June stood there, hair wild, still wrapped in her blanket. "Dad?" she whispered. He turned. "Morning, kiddo," she yawned. "You're up early." "Couldn't sleep." She padded over to the porch rail, staring at the water. "It's almost our 100th day." "I know," he said. "You kept your promise." She smiled. "We did." The first full rays of the sun broke across the river, catching on the wet spokes of the wheel until it looked like gold spinning through water. The mill windows glowed from the inside out, reflecting the town beyond. Houses, fields, the narrow road where people would soon walk toward the co-op again. Somewhere down the street, a rooster crowed. Then a truck door slammed, a child laughed, and the world began to stir. June turned to him. "It's beautiful." He nodded. "Keep it that way." When she went back inside, he lingered a moment longer, watching the light spread. The mill, once a ruin, now breathed in rhythm with the morning. The water moved, the wheel turned, and the town hummed awake. Everything, finally, was in motion. If you watched until the end, please subscribe to help support our channel. Thank you for watching.